Factual background. On August 21, 2012, Jim Zuppi attended a music concert with friends. At approximately 11 p.m., Mr. Zuppi and his group were waiting for the arrival of a limousine driven by a private driver. The driver had been stuck in traffic and was expected to arrive within a few minutes. While waiting inside, the group received a text message that the driver was outside. Mr. Zuppi started walking to meet the driver, but when they arrived outside, the driver had still not arrived. Mr. Zuppi witnessed a person heading to the side of a nearby building. He believed that the man was urinating. Mr. Zuppi reported that he also needed to use the restroom urgently. Mr. Zuppi is a medically retired veteran who suffered a broken back. Mr. Zuppi reports that his medical condition sometimes prompts urgent urination. Mr. Zuppi walked to an area which he believed to be concealed from public view and urinated. A few moments after reaching the area, Mr. Zuppi began walking back in the general direction of his friends who were now in the limousine. According to Mr. Zuppi, as his friends watched from the limo, a door swung open at a nearby building. It was a building leased by the University of Washington. Officer Pratt-Wieburg began running towards Mr. Zuppi.
I was just nonchalant walking, and then she stopped me, and then whatever. So then the car was right there. She said, "You go up towards that car, and, I'm going to get you for fleeing." I put my hands up because she was pulling something out. I don't know, it was a taser or a gun. So I walked over to this part of the stairs away from the car to sit down to show that I was complying.
Officer Pratt-Wieburg said, "Talk to me." She did not identify herself as a police officer, nor did she explain why she had the authority to detain Mr. Zuppi. Without provocation or permission, Officer Pratt-Wieburg put her arm around Mr. Zuppi. Pratt-Wieburg asked, "What are you doing?" Mr. Zuppi asked Officer Wieburg, "Excuse me, lady, are you building security?" According to Mr. Zuppi, Officer Pratt-Wieburg became extremely angry. She moved close to him, standing nose to nose. Officer Pratt-Wieburg responded, "Now you're under arrest for resisting." According to Mr. Zuppi, Officer Pratt-Wieburg grabbed his right hand. Officer Pratt-Wieburg told Mr. Zuppi to sit down. According to Mr. Zuppi, she was yelling loudly. Mr. Zuppi states that Officer Pratt-Wieburg persisted in aggressively stepping into his personal space, causing him to turn his head from side to side to avoid touching her nose.
I'm over, got nose to nose, screaming at me. Looked at the town car driver. He said something. I looked back, and our noses touched. And I'm like, "Jesus Christ, get the fuck out of my face." And then she's trying to pull me over on my face.
Mr. Zuppi asked, "What the hell are you doing?" Mr. Zuppi reports that he was confused and alarmed by the officer's unprofessional conduct. He asked Officer Pratt-Wieburg to please get out of his face. Mr. Zuppi states that Officer Wieburg continued to refuse to identify herself and failed to explain the reason for her contact. Moments later, Officer Pratt-Wieburg attempted to force Mr. Zuppi onto his face. A second officer named Davis arrived, approaching from behind. Officer Pratt-Wieburg told Davis he doesn't believe we are law enforcement. To defuse the situation, Mr. Zuppi stated that he squatted down to demonstrate his cooperation and that he was not a threat.
She was pulling something out. I don't know, it was a taser or a gun. So I walked over to this part of the stairs away from the car to sit down to show that I was complying. And I put my hands on my knees. I want to sit down now. I'm going to sit on this top step over here like this. And then she come over, got nose to nose, screaming at me. Looked at the town car driver. He said something. I looked back, and our noses touched. And she's trying to pull me over on my face. And then the guy comes up behind me.
According to Mr. Zuppi, Officer Pratt-Wieburg complained that he wasn't answering questions and that he didn't say how old he was. The officer stood Mr. Zuppi on his feet. Officer Pratt-Wieburg's repeated claim that Mr. Zuppi refused to provide ID or that he was uncooperative regarding his identity is simply not true. Officer Pratt-Wieburg's own partner contradicted her statements in her reports and in her trial testimony by claiming Mr. Zuppi actually did provide his ID. Mr. Zuppi reports that Pratt-Wieburg said, "All you have to do is say your birthday." Mr. Zuppi said, "I gave you my military ID." Officer Pratt-Wieburg began to question Mr. Zuppi, asking him his age along with several other personal questions. It is my opinion that at this juncture, Mr. Zuppi was under no obligation to produce identification under Washington state law. Officer Pratt-Wieburg instructed Officer Davis to arrest him. She yelled, "He's obstructing." During Officer Davis's deposition at a later date, he confirmed that Mr. Zuppi gave Officer Pratt-Wieburg his ID. He also confirmed that he became aware Mr. Zuppi was a longshoreman during the encounter. Mr. Zuppi responded by telling the officers he had a military disability and an injured back. But according to Mr. Zuppi, the officers ordered him to stand up. Mr. Zuppi states that he was attempting to cooperate, and as he leaned forward, Officer Davis said, "No, not this direction." Suddenly, Officer Pratt-Wieburg began pulling him in the opposite direction in what Mr. Zuppi describes as a tug-of-war between the officers.
The cop car was there, the cop car was pointed just like that, right at the whole thing, and then they shuffled me down here like this. Then all of a sudden, bam! And I went, bam, pointing in that direction.
So those are steps.
Yeah. And then she jumped on the people in the car, because the planners and stuff, and it was dark. They're scrambling over each other to get out of the car to video, so they didn't get to see the arm twisting because her broadness is as good as mine or bigger. So the other guy in the black.
During the arrest, Officer Davis wrenched Mr. Zuppi's arm up behind his back. At the same time, Officer Pratt-Wieburg forced him forward. He hit the pavement head first, and moments later, Officer Davis kneed him in the back. On a video taken by an eyewitness shortly after the arrest, Officer Pratt-Wieburg can be heard telling Mr. Zuppi all he had to do was say his birthday. Mr. Zuppi sustained injuries to his shoulder, which was severely torn. Because of Officer Davis and Pratt-Wieburg's aggressive and violent maneuver, forcing Mr. Zuppi forward while twisting him, Mr. Zuppi tore his rotator cuff, injured his ligaments, and twisted his bicep, resulting in an injury.
So yeah, why was your friends... Were they taking pictures?
He walks up, you'll see in the video, you'll see him walk up, and she's yelling without even looking back, "Get back, get back, get back." She doesn't want people to see my arm strewn across my back. And then you hear the handcuffs click, click. And then Joe's questioning him and stuff, and I'm knocked out at that point, and then she's like yelling, "Get back, or you're going to be next." And Joe's like, "Nobody's going to be next because we didn't do nothing." And she's like, "Well, he was."
Get back! Get back!
Oh, we're back. We're back. We're back.
Okay.
I'm really okay. The guy peed in the lawn.
I don't know what's happening.
No, he peed in the lawn, and you got him on the ground. End of story. He peed in the lawn.
She was being... You are about to be next.
Hold on, man.
Nobody's going to be next because we ain't done nothing. He peed in the lawn, and that's it. Now you got a handcuffed.
As Mr. Zuppi described it, his arm was twisted up and backward like a turkey leg. He sustained injuries to his knee and his neck. According to Mr. Zuppi, he lost approximately $220,000 in wage income. His medical bills were over $70,000. He has also spent approximately $25,000 seeking justice in his case and over what appears to be a case of a $24 infraction for urinating in public. The criminal charges against Mr. Zuppi were eventually dropped. He filed a civil lawsuit which he lost. However, Mr. Zuppi pointed out that the officers testified falsely on multiple occasions during their testimony under oath. I have investigated the issue of false statements by the officers, and I have also investigated excessive force complaints made by Mr. Zuppi. The officers did not testify consistently with what they wrote in their reports. The departures were not minor, but rather significant. My review of the arrest and my analysis of the use of force are summarized in my report. I have identified several key findings based on the police reports, trial testimony, and policies of the University of Washington Police Department. In her police report, Officer Pratt-Wieburg states that she witnessed Mr. Zuppi urinating on university property. She states that she approached Mr. Zuppi and directed him to sit down. Officer Pratt-Wieburg states Mr. Zuppi was asked for identification. When she requested his date of birth, she claims that he stood up and began walking away. According to Officer Wieburg, Mr. Zuppi yelled and resisted arrest. However, a videotape of Mr. Zuppi's arrest confirms that he was yelling, but but it appears that he was yelling in pain after the injuries the officers inflicted upon him. A complete video of the encounter is no longer available because it was destroyed improperly by University of Washington police officials. I spent approximately 25 hours speaking with Mr. Zuppi about his case and gathering evidence. My review of Mr. Zuppi's case included extensive review of police reports, witness video, trial deposition transcripts, and witness statements. Both officers gave false testimony regarding Mr. Zuppi providing identification, and there appears to be false testimony regarding Mr. Zuppi's actions prior to his arrest. Officer Pratt-Wieburg did not follow proper policy regarding identifying herself as a police officer. During the encounter, Officer Pratt-Wieburg falsely identified herself as a Seattle police officer. The officers testified falsely that they are not required to identify themselves. However, state law does require the officers to identify themselves. Officer Pratt-Wieburg said under oath that she had a clean record, but she was testifying falsely. Mr. Zuppi refusing to say his birthday is not obstruction. It is my opinion, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that Officer Pratt-Wieburg and Officer Davis engaged in conduct which was not supported by policy or training regarding the performance of law enforcement officers under similar circumstances. It is also my opinion that they testified falsely at deposition and trial stages of Mr. Zuppi's civil case. The force used against Mr. Zuppi appears to be excessive.